Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, one of humanity's oldest and most profound questions. Where did everything come from?
Right.
But this isn't just philosophy or cosmology. We're actually dissecting the very architecture of your own mind. Our main source for this is a really fascinating piece, From Simulation to Creation, Cognitive Echoes and Cosmological Arguments in Human Meaning-Making by Skylar Fiction. What makes it so compelling, I think, is how it bridges philosophy with empirical cognitive science, pulling in work from scholars like William Lane Craig, Karen Shanton, and Alvin Goldman.
Yeah, and what's really intriguing here is the hybrid argument it puts forward. It basically asks, could our fundamental belief in the universe's origin, or, even in a divine creator, be profoundly shaped, maybe even compelled by the neural tools our brains use every single day? Things like empathy, memory, planning for the future. We're going to explore whether we just reason our way to these beliefs or if we're, in a sense, simulating them internally.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this really intricate relationship between how our brains are wired and our deepest metaphysical intuitions. Think of this as an advanced seminar, maybe, on the mind's role in shaping how we perceive reality itself.
Okay.
Let's dive in. 1. The mind is a simulation engine. Understanding cognitive architecture. Okay, so to kick things off, let's lay some groundwork. The source introduces this concept called simulation theory. For those maybe new to it, what exactly is it, and how does it challenge some older ideas about how we understand the world?
Right. So at its core, simulation theory, as folks like Karen Shanton and Alvin Goldman explore it, suggests that when we understand other people, or even when we think about our own past or future, we don't just use detached logic. Instead, our minds actually imitate, copy, or re-experience those mental processes or events internally. It's like running a little simulation.
Hmm.
And this is a pretty big departure from the older theory idea, which suggested we form abstract, almost scientific-like theories about other minds.
That is a big shift. Okay, building on that, what about mirror neurons? I've heard about those. How do they fit into this simulation picture?
Ah, mirror neurons are absolutely fascinating. They were first spotted in macaques, and they fire both when an animal performs an action and when it just observes the same action being done by someone else. In humans, it seems this mirroring goes beyond just physical actions. It applies to emotions like pain and maybe even complex intentions.
So, like, if I see you wince, my brain kind of winces too.
Exactly, yeah. On a neural level, some of the same pathways get subtly activated. It's a shortcut, you could say. It dramatically reduces the cognitive load, the mental effort needed to figure out what someone else might be feeling or thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. But simulation isn't just about understanding others, right? The source mentions intrapersonal simulation and mental time travel. What does that mean for how we experience our own lives, our past, our future?
Precisely. Shanton and Goldman argue that our episodic memory, vividly recalling past experiences and prospection imagining future possibilities, are themselves forms of internal simulation. We're not just passively retrieving data, we're actively rebuilding moments or generating plausible future scripts in our minds.
Right, like playing out scenarios.
Exactly. And this mental time travel uses the same basic brain networks as understanding other people mind reading. This leads to a pretty radical idea that human consciousness itself is fundamentally a simulation engine, constantly projecting these internally modeled realities. It suggests epistemology, how we know anything, might begin not with pure logic, but with simulation.
Wow. Okay, so if our brains are constantly simulating time, causality, beginnings, just for everyday survival, what does this imply about our almost instinctual drive to think that everything, even the whole cosmos, must have a beginning and a cause?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If our minds are inherently wired to simulate beginnings, to infer causes, to project intention onto things, might this strongly predispose us towards certain metaphysical beliefs? Beliefs about the universe's origin, for example. It suggests we might not just reason our way to the idea of creation. We might be, in a very real sense, simulating it using the same neural tools evolved for empathy, memory, and looking ahead.
So it doesn't dismiss the belief, but it gives it a cognitive underpinning.
Exactly. It recontextualizes where that strong feeling, that intuition might come from, too. The Kalam Cosmological Argument and our cognitive defaults.
Okay, let's connect this directly now. Let's talk about one of the most persistent arguments for a cosmic beginning, the Kalam Cosmological Argument. For listeners who might not be familiar, could you quickly outline its core premises? William Lane Craig is often associated with developing it.
Sure. The Kalam is known for its simplicity, really. It goes like this. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, Therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning.
Pretty straightforward. Now, Craig argues that the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, isn't just logic. He calls it a deep intuitive truth. Denying it, he says, is worse than magic. Why does this premise resonate so powerfully with us? What does the essay suggest about that feeling of it being just obvious?
The essay suggests its power comes precisely because it echoes the fundamental structure of how our minds work. We are, as it puts it, cause-seeking, pattern-making, simulation-driven agents.
From infancy, right?
Yeah.
We push a block, it falls. We learn cause and effect. Our whole understanding of past events and future possibilities is built on simulations that are, by their nature, temporally ordered, causally structured, and imbued with agency.
So the idea, something must have caused this, feels right, because that's how our brains model reality by default?
Exactly. It's a cognitive default setting, you might say. Okay, let's look at the second premise. The universe began to exist. How does our cognitive architecture, our mental wiring, make it incredibly difficult for us to truly grasp or imagine an infinite past?
Right.
How does that support this premise?
Well, our minds genuinely struggle with actual infinity. I mean, really grasping it. Our memories have limits, right? Our projections of the future are always finite. The essay talks about a kind of cognitive paralysis when we try to wrap our heads around a beginningless universe. Craig leverages this cognitive limitation, arguing you can't traverse an infinite series of past events one by one to reach the present. It feels impossible to simulate mentally.
Right, it breaks the simulation. That reminds me of Hilbert's Hotel, that famous thought experiment Craig often uses. Could you briefly explain that for listeners and why the source is cognitively strategic?
Sure. Hilbert's Hotel is this imaginary hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all occupied. But, paradoxically, it can always take more guests. How? Just have everyone shift down one room, room 1 moves to 2, 2 to 3, and so on, infinitely. This frees up room 1. The absurdity of full hotel that always has vacancies highlights the clash between mathematical concepts of infinity and what our minds can actually simulate in a concrete, experiential way. Our brains seem to require closure, anchors, a clear sequence of events, which an actually infinite past lacks.
So it's not just that math is weird, it's that our minds aren't built for that kind of weirdness.
Pretty much, yeah. Our simulation engine has its limits.
Which brings us to this idea that our sense of time and causality isn't just objective reality, but something constructed by consciousness. The source mentions neuroscience studies, like the chronostasis illusion, where the brain seems to play tricks with time perception. What does that tell us?
It really underscores that our experience of time and cause and effect isn't just a passive recording of events. It's actively constructed, moment by moment, by the brain. With chronostasis, when your eyes jump, your brain kind of backfills the gap so it feels seamless, sometimes making a clock hand seem to freeze momentarily. It shows the brain is managing our temporal experience. So when Craig argues the universe needs a beginning and a cause, he's tapping into this very deep, intuitive simulation of how events should unfold according to our cognitive wiring. Our minds instinctively resist uncaused events. We feel cognitive dissonance if no cause is apparent.
So the need for a creator could be seen as a kind of closure mechanism.
That's one way the essay frames it, yeah. A way to provide a terminal node that satisfies the simulation engine's demand for a complete, causally coherent story.
Interesting. So this doesn't necessarily invalidate the Kalam argument itself, but it certainly reframes why it feels so persuasive to many people.
Exactly. It suggests these arguments are compelling, not just potentially because of their logical structure, but because they resonate so deeply with our internal cognitive structures, how we simulate time, agency, beginnings. We believe in causes not just because causes might be objectively real out there, but because causality is fundamentally how we think.
So the question becomes twofold. Is the argument sound logic?
Mm-hmm.
And is it also, in a way, cognitively inevitable for us?
That's a great way to put it. 3, egocentric bias and the projection of agency.
Let's shift gears slightly to another fascinating aspect of our mental machinery, egocentric bias. How does this cognitive distortion, this tendency to see things from our own perspective, affect these simulations we're talking about, especially when we tackle huge concepts like the universe's origin?
Right. Egocentric bias is our default tendency to anchor our understanding of others' mental states or future events or even abstract truths in our own limited viewpoint. Shanton and Goldman talk about how in simulation we often fail to quarantine or inhibit our own genuine states. We essentially project ourselves onto the simulation target.
Can you give us a quick example of that failure to quarantine, something relatable?
Sure. There are studies, like one by Van Boven and Lowenstein, where people who were thirsty assumed that other people, even hypothetical ones they were told about, were also thirsty and would value water more highly. Even when they were specifically asked to take the other person's perspective, their own thirst biased their judgment. Or think about how your current mood colors your memories of past events. That's egocentric bias shaping intrapersonal simulation.
Okay, got it. So if we naturally project ourselves onto others, what happens when we try to simulate or understand the first cause that the Kalam argument points to? The argument just says there's a cause. But many theists go further, saying this cause must be personal, intentional, intelligent. Is that purely a deduction, or could it be partly a projection of our own kind of agency?
That's a critical question the essay raises. It argues that making that leap from a cause to a personal, intentional cause looks very similar to how we simulate decisions in other human minds. We imagine their desires, their beliefs to predict what they'll do. The risk, due to egocentric bias, is that we inadvertently project our own ways of thinking, our own preferences, onto that simulation. So, the God described in some metaphysical arguments might be, at least in part, a simulation of human-like agency scaled up, a kind of cognitively anthropomorphic creator.
So when we feel the first cause must have chosen to create, is that because the logic demands it? Or because our simulation engine primarily understands causation through the lens of intentional agents like ourselves?
That's precisely the potential issue. It might be another example of egocentric bias at work, a failure to quarantine our familiar model of self from the metaphysical model we're building. The source mentions a really striking study. Patients with brain damage to the anterior insula, which is involved in feeling and mirroring emotions like disgust. These patients struggled to recognize disgust in others' faces because they couldn't simulate that feeling themselves.
Wow, so if you can't simulate it, you can't recognize it.
Right. Simulation failure leads to mind-reading failure. The analogy the essay draws is, are we potentially failing to recognize other kinds of causality, maybe impersonal ones, at the origin of the universe simply because we lack the cognitive tools to simulate them?
And following that logic, even the unease or discomfort some people feel with the idea of an impersonal cosmos, a beginning without a conscious beginner, that might not be a purely rational objection.
It might be more of a simulated emotional aversion, yes. The existential discomfort that sometimes accompanies atheistic cosmologies could be, cognitively speaking, similar to the difficulty of empathizing with something radically different from us. Our system resists it not necessarily because it's logically false, but because it's hard to model within our familiar framework. Belief in a personal creator, in this view, can function as a kind of epistemic economy.
Meaning it's mentally efficient.
Exactly. It provides a satisfying narrative closure, fulfilling our cognitive drive for an identifiable cause, an agent, neatly centering the cosmos within our default template of intentional action. 4. The sacred as simulation, art, fiction, and religious belief.
Okay, so if simulation is this fundamental way our minds grasp causes, agents, maybe even time itself, it doesn't seem like a huge leap to wonder about its role in other deep human experiences like aesthetics or religion. Are those moments of transcendence, the awe we feel looking at art, or even core religious beliefs, are these also forms of simulation?
The essay argues strongly that yes, they are. Simulation theory isn't just about understanding everyday actions. It extends into aesthetics, fiction, and religion, acting not just as a cognitive shortcut, but as a powerful meaning generator. Take fiction, for instance. Kendall Walton's work suggests our emotional responses to stories. Crying at a character's death, feeling suspense, come from engaging in games of make-believe. These are deeply simulational.
So we're not actually fooled into thinking the character is real?
No, not at all. But we simulate a scenario where that death matters, where the stakes are real within the game, and that simulation produces genuine, effective states, real emotions.
And religion then operates similarly.
Yes, the argument is that it does. Rituals, sacred texts, prayers, liturgy, even moral imagination, these are described as simulation-rich environments. The worshiper isn't just thinking about God in an abstract way. They might be actively simulating divine presence, simulating a relationship. Sacred stories aren't just historical claims. They function as simulational frameworks for living, feeling, remembering, and hoping.
Frameworks for simulation.
Right. And the attributes of the divine omniscience, perfect love, justice, even wrath, become concepts that are simulated emotionally and morally within the believer's mind.
This sounds like it connects to that idea some listeners might know from cognitive science of religion, HAGDs, or hyperactive agency detection devices.
It absolutely connects,
Yeah.
yes. Research in that field suggests belief in gods, spirits, supernatural agents might emerge partly from these evolutionary adaptations. We're primed to detect agency, sometimes overly so. Think about our ancestors hearing a rustle in the bushes. It's safer, evolutionarily speaking, to simulate a potential agent, a predator, and be wrong than to fail to simulate one and be right, fatally so.
Better safe than, neurologically speaking.
Exactly. And this bias towards detecting agency could, over time, become a template for interpreting ambiguous or unexplained phenomena, making the concept of the sacred a kind of saturated simulation seeing agency everywhere.
So again, this perspective doesn't necessarily say religious belief is just a delusion, but rather that it's rooted in a very deep, perhaps universal psychological mechanism.
Precisely. It reframes it. It suggests that just as mirror neurons might allow us to vicariously feel another person's pain, perhaps religious simulation allows individuals to feel, to experience the presence of the divine. If the sacred is experienced as both transcendent out there and psychologically constructed inside our minds, then that boundary between inner and outer gets blurry. God, in this framework, could be understood as both an objective reality and a reflection of our cognitive image of ultimate mind.
That's quite a thought. And this applies to art too. The awe we feel before incredible beauty is somehow neurologically similar to religious awe.
There's good evidence for that, yes.
Yes.
Neuroaesthetic studies show that when people view highly expressive art, think of the power in Michelangelo's sculptures or the energy in Van Gogh's brushstrokes, their brains activate motor and emotional simulation pathways. It's like they are literally subtly feeling the artist's gesture, the embedded intention, the emotion. It's sometimes called bodily empathy. So if aesthetic experience is fundamentally simulational in this way, then yes, the awe we feel before profound beauty seems neurologically akin to the awe described in profound religious experience. They tap into similar deep simulation mechanisms.
So putting it all together, belief in God isn't just something argued rationally, like with the Kalam argument. It's also intuitively simulated, aesthetically mirrored, and emotionally rehearsed, all within the workings of our brain.
That's a very powerful synthesis offered by this perspective, yes. 5. Philosophical and psychological convergence. The Kantian echo.
Okay, as we start to bring these threads together, let's pull back for a moment. This whole discussion, mirror neurons, cosmological arguments, simulation, seems to echo some much older philosophical ideas. The deep dive specifically mentions Immanuel Kant, who argued that our basic cognitive framework, our understanding of space, time, causality, doesn't just passively receive reality, but actively shapes our experience of it. How does this Kantian insight connect with both the Kalam argument and simulation theory?
That's a really crucial connection the source draws out. Kant's big idea was that space, time, causality aren't necessarily features of the world in itself, things as they are independent of us, but are fundamental categories or structures of human understanding. They're like the built-in operating system through which we must experience anything at all. And the source points out that both the persuasive power of the Kalam argument, tapping into our intuitive sense of cause and beginning, and the findings of simulation theory showing how we construct experience internally really do echo this Kantian epistemology. We seem to be, in a very real sense, interpreting the world through the forms of our own understanding, even when we're trying to think about ultimate reality beyond our direct experience.
We're always wearing our Kantian glasses, so to speak.
You could put it that way, yes.
Okay, so if our understanding is shaped this way, it seems to open up at least two big philosophical possibilities regarding the origins of our beliefs, particularly religious or metaphysical ones. The source outlines a skeptical path and maybe a more open-ended one. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. The skeptical path, drawing on this cognitive perspective, would suggest that if our beliefs in, say, a creator arise from these evolved cognitive mechanisms like simulation, agency detection, egocentric bias, well, then maybe these beliefs primarily reflect our psychological makeup, our adaptations, rather than accurately tracking objective external reality. This is kind of in the vein of thinkers like Feuerbach or Freud, who saw religion largely as a human projection. The sacred is simulated, full stop.
Okay, that's the skeptical take. What's the alternative, the more open-ended one?
The second path, which the source seems more inclined towards exploring, suggests that the very fact that humans are wired, this way wired, to simulate meaning, agency, perhaps even the sacred, might itself be profoundly significant. Maybe simulation isn't just a cognitive quirk or source of bias, but could actually be a channel, a way our minds are constituted to tune into dimensions of reality or meaning that go beyond purely empirical data gathering. On this view, the mind might not be simply inventing God out of its own biases, but perhaps resonating with something real, even if the way it renders that reality is inevitably filtered through our specific human cognitive forms.
That's fascinating. The essay also brings up that theological concept of humans being made in the image of God and offers a kind of cognitive science corollary to it. What's that connection?
Right, the corollary flips it slightly. It suggests that perhaps we inevitably imagine God in the image of ourselves, not necessarily out of arrogance, but because the only tools we have for imagining any mind, let alone an ultimate one, are the cognitive structures we possess, our own models of agency, intention, emotion, causality. However, the open-ended path adds, if God is real, then perhaps those very cognitive structures, our capacity for empathy via mirroring, our grasp of causality, our ability to remember and project, might be precisely the means through which such a reality could interact with us or be apprehended by us.
So our limitations become the point of contact. Belief becomes both potentially projected from us, but also possibly invited from beyond us. A mirror that might also be a window.
That's a beautiful way to put it, yes. The mind believes, simulates, seeks coherence because that's its nature. That drive might simply reflect our evolved limitations, or it might be an inbuilt invitation to discover a deeper meaning that resonates with those very structures. This isn't arguing for naive realism, that we see things exactly as they are. It's suggesting something more like cognitive realism. Perhaps our cognitive filters, our simulation engines, are actually the necessary interface for connecting with certain kinds of truth. Outro.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we're really left with a profound paradox, aren't we? A truly compelling question to ponder. Are we essentially finite minds projecting order onto what might be chaos? Are we creating a simulated cosmos simply because our brains demand beginnings causes creators to make narrative sense of existence?
Or is the alternative possibility true, as the essay provocatively suggests? Is simulation not the enemy of truth, not just a bias machine, but actually its necessary interface? Could our specific cognitive architecture, our inherent grasp of causality, our sense of moral gravity, our capacity for aesthetic and even spiritual reverence, could this be the very way a potentially created order discloses itself to creatures like us?
The text by Skylar Fiction really pushes us to consider that if God exists, then maybe the mind that simulates him, that reaches for him, does so not fundamentally in error, but in resonance. Maybe a created world logically requires creatures capable of simulating their creator not in order to invent him, but perhaps ultimately to recognize him.
And that implies we shouldn't necessarily dismiss belief simply because we can trace its psychological or neurological construction. The fact that it is constructed, that it takes shape within our minds, might be the only way such belief could ever be experienced by us.
So the final thought we want to leave you with, our dedicated listener, is really a pair of questions. Is God just a simulation generated by the complexities of the human brain? Or is the simulation itself the very medium, the veil perhaps, through which God speaks, the mechanism through which we might come to know? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into this fascinating, really mind-bending intersection of human cognition, philosophy, and the deepest questions of existence. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and definitely keep simulating those amazing insights.